The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Diane almost threw it away without opening it. It was tucked between a credit card offer and a flyer for a pizza place 2 blocks from her house, the kind of ordinary mail that piles up on a kitchen counter and gets ignored for days. But something about the handwriting made her stop. It was careful, deliberate, like someone had practiced writing her name before committing it to the envelope. Diane Whitfield. No one wrote her full name like that anymore. Not even her own mother, back when her mother still remembered things like names and addresses and the fact that she had a daughter at all. Diane stood in her kitchen with the mail in one hand and her car keys in the other, already running 15 minutes late for work, and she almost set the letter down on the counter to deal with later. Almost. But her thumb slid under the flap before she made a conscious decision to open it. The way your body sometimes moves faster than your mind can talk it out of something. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My name is Sarah. I think I might be your daughter. I know this is strange to read, and I am sorry if it is unwelcome. I am not asking for anything. I only wanted to know if you would be willing to meet me, even once, even for coffee. If not, I understand, and I will not write again. There was a phone number at the bottom. Nothing else. No last name, no explanation of how she had found this address, no photograph. Diane read it twice standing in her kitchen, and then a third time sitting down, because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her up. She was 51 years old. She had a husband named Robert, who was currently upstairs shaving, humming something tuneless the way he always did, oblivious to the fact that the floor of his wife's life had just opened up beneath her. She had 2 grown sons who knew nothing about a sister. She had spent 25 years building a life so carefully ordinary that most days she forgot there was anything underneath it to hide. And now there was a letter on her kitchen counter with a phone number that could undo all of it. She did not go to work that day. She called in sick, something she almost never did, and she sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her until the ice in her coffee melted and the light outside shifted from morning gray to the flat white of midday. She was 19 when she had the baby. 19, and terrified, and completely alone in a way that people who have never been that young and that alone cannot fully understand. The father was a boy named Michael, who disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant, vanished so completely that she sometimes wondered if she had imagined the entire relationship. Her own mother, a woman named Carol who ran their household with the discipline of a drill sergeant and the warmth of a closed door, told her in no uncertain terms what would happen if she kept the baby. You will ruin your life. You will ruin this family's name. You will do the responsible thing. Diane remembered signing the papers in a small office that smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet. She remembered a nurse asking if she wanted to hold the baby first, and she remembered saying no, because some part of her 19-year-old brain understood that if she held that baby even once, she would never be able to let go. She remembered being wrong about that too, because not holding the baby did not stop her from carrying the weight of her for the next 25 years anyway. She built a life after that. She met Robert 2 years later, a steady, kind, uncomplicated man who worked in insurance and had never once, in 23 years of marriage, given her a reason to doubt him. She had 2 sons, Ethan and Marcus, and she loved them with an intensity that sometimes frightened her, because some corner of her mind always wondered if that intensity was really about them, or if it was about proving to herself that she could love a child properly this time. She never told Robert about the baby she gave up. She told herself for years that it was not a lie, just an omission, just a chapter of her life that had closed before he ever walked into the story. But sitting at her kitchen table with a letter in her hand, she understood for the first time that an omission held for 25 years stops being a small thing. It becomes its own kind of house, and you have been living inside it the whole time without noticing the walls. She did not call the number that day. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept old bank statements and warranty cards, things that mattered but did not need to be looked at often, and she told herself she needed time to think. She thought about it for 6 days. On the 7th day, she called. The voice on the other end was younger than she expected, though of course it would be, since the girl who answered was 25, and Diane had been picturing, in some irrational corner of her mind, a baby. "Hello," the voice said, careful, like she had been waiting by the phone for exactly this call and did not quite believe it was finally happening. "Is this Sarah?" Diane asked, and her own voice came out smaller than she intended. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Diane wondered if the call had dropped. "Yes," Sarah said finally. "This is Sarah." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, a neutral place neither of them had any history with, the kind of place where you could sit across from a stranger who might be your daughter, and no one around you would think anything unusual was happening. Diane arrived 20 minutes early and sat in her car in the parking lot, watching people come and go through the glass door, trying to guess which one might be Sarah. She had told Robert she was meeting an old coworker for coffee, and the lie had come out of her mouth so smoothly that it frightened her a little, how easily 25 years of practice could produce something like that. At exactly 10 o'clock, a young woman walked in, wearing a gray coat, her dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail, and something about the shape of her jaw made Diane's chest tighten before the woman even looked her way. It was like looking at a photograph of herself from 30 years ago, if that photograph had been taken by someone with better lighting and more patience. Sarah spotted her immediately, as if she too had memorized every detail of the face she had never met, and walked over without hesitation. "Diane," she said, and it was not a question. "Sarah," Diane answered, and stood up too fast, nearly knocking over her chair. They hugged, awkwardly, briefly, the kind of hug two people give each other when they do not yet know if hugging is the right thing to do, but feel that not hugging would be worse. Sarah smelled like vanilla and something clean, like laundry detergent, and for one disorienting second, Diane felt something crack open in her chest that she had spent 25 years keeping carefully sealed. They sat down. Sarah ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, the same way Diane took hers, and neither of them commented on it, though Diane noticed, and something told her that Sarah noticed too. "I don't want this to be weird," Sarah said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "I know I could have just shown up and demanded answers. Some people do that. I've read about it. But I didn't want to scare you off. I just wanted to know you a little. That's all." Diane studied her face, searching for herself in it, and found pieces everywhere. The eyes, the same pale hazel. The habit of tucking hair behind the ear before speaking. Even the way Sarah's shoulders curled slightly forward, like she was used to making herself smaller than she actually was. "How did you find me?" Diane asked, because it was the only question she could form that did not feel too enormous to say out loud. "One of those genealogy websites," Sarah explained. "I did a DNA test 2 years ago, mostly out of curiosity, and it matched me with a cousin of yours. From there it wasn't that hard. Public records, a little research. I know that probably sounds invasive." "It sounds thorough," Diane said, and meant it as something between a compliment and a warning, though she was not sure which. They talked for 2 hours that first morning, and it was easier than Diane expected in the beginning. Sarah had grown up in a town 3 hours away, adopted by a couple named the Coopers, who Diane learned had been kind, if not particularly warm. Sarah described her childhood carefully, in measured sentences, the way someone describes a country they visited once and are still deciding whether they liked. Her adoptive father had passed away 4 years ago. Her adoptive mother lived alone now in Ohio, and they spoke on the phone every Sunday, out of obligation more than closeness. "I always knew I was adopted," Sarah said. "They never hid that. But knowing you're adopted and knowing anything about the people who gave you up are two completely different things. I used to make up stories about you when I was a kid. I decided you were probably a doctor or a teacher. Someone important, who had a good reason." Diane felt something twist painfully behind her ribs at that. She had not been a doctor. She had not had a good reason. Not really. Not one that would survive being said out loud to the daughter who had spent a childhood inventing noble excuses for her absence. "I was 19, Diane said quietly. "I was scared, and I didn't have support, and I made the decision my mother told me to make. I've thought about you every single day since. I want you to know that. Not a day has gone by." Sarah's eyes glistened, but she did not cry, and Diane got the sense that this was a woman who had trained herself not to cry in front of people she did not fully trust yet. "I believe you," Sarah said. "I do." They agreed to meet again the following week, and then the week after that became a standing arrangement: coffee on Saturday mornings, sometimes lunch if the conversation ran long. Diane found herself looking forward to it with an intensity that surprised her, counting down the days the way she used to count down to Christmas as a child. She told Robert, eventually, a heavily edited version of the truth, that she had reconnected with a young woman from her past, a distant relative's daughter, someone she was mentoring. Robert, being Robert, accepted this without much question, glad to see his wife happy and humming again, not realizing the humming was covering something enormous. What Diane did not know, what she could not have known, sitting across from Sarah in that coffee shop with her heart cracking open in slow, grateful pieces, was that Sarah had not found her by accident and had not come looking for coffee, or closure, or a mother. Sarah had spent 3 years building toward this moment. It had started, if you traced it back far enough, not with a DNA test, but with a woman named Margaret Cooper, Sarah's adoptive mother, sitting in a hospital room 4 years earlier, while her husband lay dying, and letting slip, in the exhausted honesty that grief sometimes produces, a detail she had kept buried for over 2 decades. "Your birth mother didn't want you," Margaret had said. Not cruelly, just tiredly, the words falling out of her like water from a cracked glass. "She signed you away before you even opened your eyes. Her own mother made her do it, I heard. Some story about family reputation. Some women just aren't built to be mothers, sweetheart. I always thought you should know that, in case you ever wondered why we were enough for you, and she wasn't." Sarah had smiled and nodded, and told her adoptive mother that of course they were enough, more than enough, and had gone home that night and sat on her bathroom floor for 3 hours, unable to explain even to herself why those words had detonated something so deep inside her chest. She had spent the following 2 years reconstructing the story from every angle she could find. Public records. An old classmate of Diane's who was surprisingly willing to gossip over a few glasses of wine at a college reunion Sarah had talked her way into attending. A great aunt, who still lived in the same small town where Diane had grown up, who remembered the pregnant 19-year-old who disappeared for 6 months and came back different, thinner, quieter, with something dead behind her eyes that never fully came back to life. Piece by piece, Sarah built a picture of a woman who had discarded her, moved on, built a beautiful, uncomplicated life with a husband and 2 sons who got to stay, who were never sent away, who never had to spend a single night wondering if they were wanted. A woman who had apparently never looked back, never searched, never so much as hired a private investigator to check if her daughter had ended up safe. That last part was not entirely true, though Sarah did not know it yet, and would not have believed it if she had. What Sarah did know, with absolute certainty, was that she wanted Diane to feel exactly what she had felt. Not through violence, nothing so crude or so easily punished. She wanted something slower, something that would require Diane to invest, to open her heart fully, to let herself believe that this second chance was real and good, and hers to keep, before Sarah pulled it away and let her watch it shatter. She wanted to become someone Diane could not live without, and then disappear so completely that the loss would echo for the rest of Diane's life, the same way Sarah's own emptiness had echoed through hers. It was, Sarah told herself in the quiet moments alone in her apartment, not cruelty. It was justice. It was simply handing back exactly what had been given to her, wrapped in different paper. But sitting across from Diane in that coffee shop, watching this careful, guarded, clearly lonely woman light up like a struck match every time Sarah said something kind to her, Sarah felt something she had not planned for and did not have a name for yet. It felt, disturbingly, like the beginning of actually caring. She pushed the feeling down. She had a plan, and she intended to follow it, no matter what softer, more complicated thing was starting to grow underneath it, unwatered and unwanted, in the space where her anger used to live alone. 3 months into their Saturday meetings, Diane invited Sarah to dinner at the house. It was Robert's idea, actually, which surprised Diane more than it should have. He had noticed how happy she seemed after her Saturday mornings, how she came home lighter, and he suggested, with the easy generosity of a man who had no idea what he was really offering, that she should bring her young friend around sometime, let the family meet her. Diane spent 4 days deciding how to introduce Sarah, running through a dozen versions of the truth in her head, before finally deciding on the version closest to it. She waited until dinner was cleared, and her sons Ethan and Marcus had wandered off to the living room, and she told Robert, alone in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she dried a dish that was already dry. "There's something I never told you," she began, and the whole story came out of her in pieces, some of it in the wrong order, all of it true. Robert was quiet for a long time after she finished. He was not an angry man by nature, and he did not become one that night, but something in his face changed, a kind of recalculation happening behind his eyes as he tried to fit 23 years of marriage around a piece of information that reshaped the shape of the woman he thought he knew completely. 25 years, he finally said. "You carried this for 25 years and never told me." "I was ashamed," Diane said. "I didn't know how to say it without you thinking less of me." "I would never have thought less of you," Robert said, though his voice carried a wound underneath the words that suggested something had shifted anyway, something that would take longer than one conversation to fully heal. But he agreed to meet Sarah. He agreed because he was a good man, and because he could see how much his wife needed this, needed the chance to finally do right by a decision she had spent half her life regretting. Sarah came to dinner on a Friday evening in early autumn, wearing a soft blue dress and carrying a bottle of wine she had clearly chosen with great care, and she was, by every measure, perfect. Warm with Robert, charming with Ethan and Marcus, complimentary about the house without being obsequious, funny in exactly the self-deprecating way that made people trust her instantly. Diane watched her family fall for Sarah over the course of that evening, watched her sons laugh at her jokes and her husband relax visibly in her presence, and felt something in her chest swell so large it was almost painful, a feeling she eventually identified with something like shock, as hope. For the first time in 25 years, she let herself imagine a version of her family that included all of her children, a version where the terrible decision of her 19th year could finally be undone. She did not see, because she had no reason to look for it, the way Sarah's eyes moved around the house that evening, cataloging things. The location of the spare key under the flower pot by the back door, the password Robert typed carelessly into his laptop while showing Sarah old family photos, not bothering to shield the screen from a woman he already considered practically family. The name of Diane's oldest and closest friend, mentioned in passing, filed away. Nothing sinister happened that night. It was simply an evening of dinner and wine and warmth, a family welcoming home a daughter they never knew they were missing. But as Sarah drove home afterward, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, she found herself crying in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years, and she could not have said, if anyone had asked her, whether the tears were for the plan she was building, or for the family she now knew she was about to destroy. Winter came, and with it came a rhythm that Diane had not realized she was starving for until she finally had it. Sarah became a fixture. Sunday dinners turned into Wednesday phone calls, turned into spontaneous visits that required no occasion at all. She helped Diane pick out curtains for the guest room, the one Diane had started calling Sarah's room without quite noticing she had done it. She went with Ethan to look at cars when he was deciding on his first real purchase after landing a job, and came back laughing about how stubborn he was, how he reminded her of Diane in the way he refused to admit he was wrong about anything, You two have the same face when you're annoyed, Sarah told Diane one evening. And Diane had laughed so hard she nearly cried, because it was such an ordinary, familial thing to say, the kind of thing mothers and daughters said to each other after years of watching each other's expressions, and she had never once, in 25 years, thought she would get to hear something like that directed at her. Robert warmed to Sarah slowly, and then all at once, the way careful men often do. He started asking her opinion on things. He taught her how he liked to grill steaks, a strange sacred ritual he had never fully explained to his own sons, and stood beside her at the grill that spring, explaining the exact moment to flip the meat with the seriousness of a man passing down a family heirloom. Marcus, the younger son, started calling her sis without irony, without hesitation, as though the word had always belonged to her. Diane began to notice small things changing in herself too. She stopped flinching at Mother's Day cards in store aisles. She stopped doing the quiet arithmetic she had done every year on a date in March, the date that would have been Sarah's birthday if she had kept her, the date she had never told anyone about, not even Robert, a private anniversary of grief she had marked alone for 25 years. This year, for the first time, she did not mark it alone. Sarah came over with a small cake, and Diane cried into her daughter's shoulder for an hour, while Robert quietly made himself scarce in the garage, understanding without being told that this was something between mother and daughter that did not need an audience. "I used to hate this day," Diane admitted, her voice thick. "Every year. I would just get through it and not tell anyone why." "I know," Sarah said softly. "I mean, I didn't know, but I understand it now. I used to hate my birthday too. I never knew why exactly. I think some part of me always knew there was a story underneath it I didn't have access to." Diane held her tighter at that, not noticing, in her flood of relief and love, how carefully constructed that sentence had been, how precisely it was designed to land exactly where it landed. What Diane did not know was that Sarah was keeping two separate journals during this period. One was a leather-bound notebook she kept in her nightstand, the one she had started 3 years earlier, back when this had all been cold and clear and purely tactical. In it, she had once written detailed notes on Diane's schedule, on Robert's passwords, on the exact worth of the house and the life insurance policies she had learned about from an overheard conversation at that first dinner. She had written plans, at one point, actual plans, for how she might slowly insert herself into their finances, how she might, over the course of a year or two, position herself to inherit or extract something substantial before vanishing, leaving Diane not just heartbroken but financially gutted, a mirror of how abandoned and powerless Sarah herself had once felt. The other notebook was new. She had started it almost by accident, one night after a dinner where Robert had shown her old photo albums, pictures of Diane young and pregnant with Ethan, radiant in a way Sarah had never gotten to see, had never been allowed to be part of. Sarah had gone home that night and, instead of updating her plan, had simply started writing about her day. About the way Diane's hands moved when she was nervous, always toward her collarbone, touching a small gold necklace she wore every single day. About the specific, embarrassing joy of being taught to make her grandmother's, no, Diane's mother's, no, this was getting complicated even in her own head, of being taught to make a pot roast recipe that had apparently been passed down for 3 generations, a recipe Sarah had never had any legal or biological right to inherit, and now somehow possessed anyway. She stopped writing in the first notebook almost entirely by March. She told herself she was just busy. She told herself the plan was simply on pause while she gathered more information. She did not let herself examine, too closely, the growing gap between the woman she had built in her mind for 3 years, a cold, selfish creature who deserved to suffer, and the woman who sat across from her every week, wearing her grief and her love so plainly on her face that it was becoming physically difficult to keep hating her. But the anger had not disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, the way a fire goes quiet under a thick layer of ash, still burning underneath, still capable of roaring back to life the moment something disturbed the surface. The disturbance came in April, in the form of a woman named Patricia. Patricia had been Diane's closest friend since college, the kind of friend who had earned the right to say difficult things without being asked to leave the room afterward. She had watched the entire Sarah situation unfold from a careful distance, happy for her friend, but never quite as swept up in the enchantment as everyone else in Diane's family seemed to be. She had a private investigator's instinct for people, honed over 2 decades of watching her friends make questionable decisions about men, jobs, and now, apparently, daughters. She invited Diane to lunch in April, ostensibly to catch up, and waited until they were most of the way through their salads before she said what she had actually invited Diane there to say. "I did some digging," Patricia said carefully. "On Sarah." Diane's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What kind of digging?" "I have a friend, from my old job, who does background checks for a living. I asked her to look into a few things. I know you're going to be upset with me for this, and honestly, maybe I deserve that. But Diane, something about all of this has felt off to me from the beginning, and I couldn't shake it, and I love you too much to just sit here and say nothing." Diane set down her fork entirely now, her appetite gone, replaced by a cold, spreading dread. "What did you find?" It took Patricia's friend 3 weeks to piece it together, but the outline she brought back was clear enough to be alarming even in summary. Sarah had, in the 2 years before contacting Diane, taken an unusual number of courses: genealogy research, legal seminars on inheritance and estate planning, oddly specific for a 25-year-old with no family money of her own to plan around. She had also, 6 months before that first letter arrived, quietly opened a private investigator's file on Diane's family, one that a records request had partially surfaced, containing notes on the value of the house, on Robert's job title and approximate salary, on the ages and occupations of both sons. And there was one more thing. Sarah had legally changed her name twice in the last 5 years. Once, from her adoptive name to a different one, unrelated to either family, which she had used for roughly 18 months before changing it back. "My friend couldn't find a clear reason for it in the public records," Patricia said. "But taken together, with everything else, it doesn't look like a woman who just wanted to meet her birth mother out of curiosity. It looks like someone who was building towards something." Diane sat frozen in the restaurant booth, the noise of the lunch crowd around her fading into a dull hum, as everything she had let herself believe over the past 9 months rearranged itself violently in her mind. The careful, guarded way Sarah had approached that first meeting. The precise, almost rehearsed quality some of her most touching comments had always carried. Comments Diane had chalked up to a young woman who had clearly thought a great deal about this reunion. The way Sarah had asked, early on and repeatedly, gentle-seeming questions about the house, about Robert's work, about what Diane and Robert had planned for retirement. She had thought it was simply curiosity, a daughter wanting to know her family. "I don't believe it," Diane said, though her voice did not sound convinced even to her own ears. "She's not like that. You've met her, Patricia. You've seen how she is with the boys, with Robert." "I've seen how she is when she knows she's being watched," Patricia said gently. "I'm not saying she's a monster. I'm saying something about the timeline doesn't add up, and I think you owe it to yourself, and to your family, to at least ask her some hard questions before you hand her anything else." Diane went home that afternoon in a fog, and for the first time in 9 months, she found herself watching Sarah's next visit with something other than pure, uncomplicated joy. She watched the way Sarah moved through the kitchen, comfortable now in a house she had once had to be shown around, and wondered how much of that comfort had been calculated from the very beginning. She did not confront Sarah immediately. Instead, she did something she was almost ashamed of afterward. She began quietly watching. She noticed, now that she was looking, small things she had let slide past her before. The way Sarah occasionally asked seemingly casual questions that, in retrospect, were oddly specific. Had they ever considered putting the house in a trust? Did Robert have a will? Was there life insurance, just out of curiosity, Some people never think about that kind of thing until it's too late. At the time, Diane had answered these questions freely, touched that Sarah cared enough to think about her family's future, about Robert's health, about practical matters a loving daughter might reasonably ask about. Now, replayed against Patricia's information, they took on a different shape entirely, sharp edges emerging from what had once looked soft. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not planned. It happened on a Tuesday evening in May, 3 weeks after Patricia's lunch, when Sarah stopped by unannounced to drop off a book she had promised to lend Diane, and found Diane sitting alone at the kitchen table with a folder in front of her, the folder Patricia had eventually handed over, containing everything her friend had found. Sarah saw the folder before Diane could close it, saw her own name typed at the top of a printed document, and something in her face changed so quickly, so completely, that it was almost like watching a mask fall. "What is that?" Sarah asked, though her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, in a way that told Diane she already knew. "I think you know," Diane said. "Sit down, Sarah. I think it's time we actually talked." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her hand still on the strap of her bag, clearly calculating whether to run or stay, whether the truth was recoverable, or whether this was the moment 3 years of careful planning finally collapsed in on itself. She sat down. What followed was the longest silence either of them could remember sitting through together. Diane watched Sarah's face, searching for the girl who had cried into her shoulder on her birthday, the girl who had laughed with Ethan over car dealerships, the girl who had learned to make a family recipe with genuine, visible joy, and tried to reconcile her with whatever cold, calculating stranger might have been hiding underneath that entire time. "I need you to tell me the truth," Diane finally said. "All of it. Right now. Or I need you to leave this house and never come back." And Sarah, staring down at her own hands folded on the kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten 100 meals over the past 9 months, where she had learned recipes and told secrets and let herself, slowly and against every plan she had ever made, fall in love with a family that was never supposed to be more than a means to an end, began, finally, to speak. "I found out about you 4 years ago," she said, her voice steady at first, then cracking as the words continued. "My adoptive mother told me you didn't want me, that you signed me away before you even looked at me, that some women just aren't built to be mothers. I know now that's not exactly true. I know your mother forced your hand, but at the time I only had her version, and it broke something in me that I don't think ever fully healed. I spent 2 years finding out everything I could about you, not to reconnect. I want to be honest with you now, since apparently honesty is the only thing left on the table. I found you because I wanted to hurt you the way I felt hurt. I wanted you to fall in love with me, to let me all the way into your life, your family, your home, and then I wanted to take something from you. Money, at first, I told myself. Some kind of justice, some kind of payment for 25 years of not being wanted. And then I wanted to disappear, completely, and let you understand exactly what it feels like to lose a daughter you thought you finally had." Diane's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the table to steady them. "And now?" she managed to ask. "Is that still the plan?" Sarah looked up, and for the first time since Diane had known her, she let Diane see her cry without trying to hide it, without the careful composure she had maintained through even her most emotional moments over the past 9 months. "No," she said. "God, no. Diane, I don't know what happened. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere between that first coffee and tonight, I stopped being able to hate you. I tried. I kept the notebook, I kept the plans, but every single week I came here I found something else that made the plan feel more impossible. The way you cried on my birthday. The way Robert taught me to grill steaks like it actually mattered to him that I knew how. The way Marcus started calling me sis without even thinking about it, like it was just true, like it had always been true. I don't know how to be the person who was supposed to destroy this family anymore. I think I actually love you. I think I've loved all of you for months now, and I hate myself for how I got here, and I understand completely if you can never trust a single word I say again." Diane sat with that for a long moment, feeling the two versions of Sarah, the calculating stranger and the daughter she had come to love, sitting uncomfortably inside the same shaking, crying young woman across the table from her. "I need time," Diane finally said. "I can't just decide right now how I feel about any of this. You need to leave tonight, Sarah. I need to think, and I need to talk to Robert, and I need you to understand that whatever happens next, this has changed something between us that might not be fixable." Sarah nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and stood up slowly, like every part of her body had suddenly become heavier. "I understand," she said. "I'm sorry, Diane. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I am sorry, for all of it, and especially for the parts where I actually meant what I said. Those were real. I need you to know that at least those parts were real." She left the house that night without the book she had come to drop off, leaving it forgotten on the counter, and Diane sat alone at the kitchen table for another hour before she found the strength to call Robert into the room and tell him everything. Robert's reaction, when it came, was not the explosion Diane had braced herself for. He sat very still through the entire story, his jaw tightening at certain details, his eyes closing briefly, when Diane described the folder full of financial notes Sarah had apparently compiled in the early months of their relationship. When Diane finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at some fixed point on the kitchen wall. "I keep thinking about the way she looked at the boys," he finally said. "At Thanksgiving. I keep thinking, was that fake too? Was any of it real?" "I don't know," Diane admitted. "I want to believe some of it was. I need to believe that, actually. Because the alternative is that I let a stranger with a plan to destroy us into every corner of our lives for 9 months, and I was too desperate for a daughter to see it." "You're not the only one who was desperate for her to be real," Robert said quietly. "I liked having a daughter around, Diane. I liked it more than I expected to. That doesn't mean I'm not furious. I am. But I understand, a little, why it's more complicated for you than just being furious." They did not resolve anything that night, or the next, or the one after that. Sarah did not call, and Diane did not reach out, and the house settled into a strange, hollow quiet that everyone in the family could feel, but no one quite knew how to address directly. Ethan asked once, carefully, where Sarah had gone, and Diane found she did not have an answer that felt honest enough to give her son, so she said only that Sarah needed some space, and that was, in its own strange way, entirely true. 2 weeks passed like this, the family orbiting around an absence that had somehow become as loud and present as Sarah herself had ever been. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, Diane's phone rang with a number she did not recognize, and when she answered, a stranger's voice on the other end asked if she was speaking with the emergency contact for a Sarah Cooper, because there had been an accident, and the hospital needed someone to come in as soon as possible. Diane did not remember the drive to the hospital. She would try, later, to reconstruct it, the streets she must have taken, whether she had stopped at red lights or run through them, but the entire 20 minutes existed in her memory only as a kind of white noise, a held breath that did not release until she was standing at the emergency room desk, asking for Sarah Cooper in a voice that did not sound like her own. Robert had wanted to come with her. She had told him to stay with the boys, though the truth, unspoken between them, was that she needed to do this alone, needed to walk into that hospital as the mother she had never gotten to be, without an audience, without anyone watching her figure out in real time what that word actually meant to her. A nurse led her back through a set of double doors to a small curtained area where Sarah lay on a narrow bed, her left arm in a temporary splint, a shallow cut above her eyebrow closed with 3 careful stitches, her face pale and bruised along one cheekbone in a way that made Diane's stomach drop the moment she saw it. Sarah's eyes opened when the curtain moved, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You came," Sarah finally said, her voice thick and slightly slurred from whatever painkillers they had given her. "Of course I came," Diane said, and was surprised to hear that it was true, that there had never actually been a version of that night where she did not come. The story came out in pieces over the following hour, some of it from Sarah, some of it from a police officer who stopped by to ask a few follow-up questions. Sarah had been driving home from her apartment, upset, distracted, the kind of distracted that comes from having spent 2 weeks replaying the worst conversation of your life on a loop, and had run a red light at an intersection she had driven through 1,000 times before without incident. Another car had clipped the rear of hers, sending her spinning into a guardrail. It could have been much worse. The officer said this twice, as if trying to make sure both women understood how close, much worse had actually been. Sarah had no other family listed as an emergency contact. That detail landed on Diane with an unexpected weight while she sat in the plastic chair beside the hospital bed. 25 years old, and there had been no one else to call. Her adoptive mother lived 3 hours away and, according to Sarah, mumbling this part with clear embarrassment, would likely have taken hours to actually make the drive even if reached immediately. Diane's number, apparently, was the only one Sarah had bothered updating in the hospital intake system months ago, back when things between them were still simple, still warm, still built on nothing but hope. "I'm sorry you had to see me like this," Sarah said quietly, staring at the ceiling rather than at Diane. "I'm sorry you had to come at all, after everything." "Stop apologizing for existing," Diane said, more sharply than she intended, and then softened. "I meant what I said. I came because I needed to come." That part isn't complicated, even if everything else is. They sat together in that hospital room for 3 more hours, waiting for test results, waiting for a doctor to confirm there was no concussion serious enough to require overnight observation, and somewhere in those 3 hours, without either of them quite deciding to have the conversation, they had it anyway. "I keep thinking about what you told me," Diane said eventually, her eyes fixed on the pattern of the hospital blanket rather than on Sarah's face, because it felt easier to say hard things without looking directly at the person she was saying them to. "About the plan. About wanting to hurt me the way you were hurt." "I know," Sarah said. "I've thought about nothing else for 2 weeks." Diane was quiet for a long moment, gathering something inside herself before she continued. "When I was 19, she finally said, I used to lie in bed at night and imagine you as a baby, wondering what you looked like, wondering if you were being held enough, fed enough, loved enough. And then, eventually, I stopped letting myself imagine it, because it hurt too much, and I built a wall around that whole part of my life, and I didn't let myself look at it again for years. I told myself that not looking was the same as being okay. I think what I'm trying to say is, I understand the anger better than you might realize. Not the plan, not the specifics of what you were going to do, but the rage underneath it. I carried a version of that rage myself, for years, at my own mother, for making me give you up, for taking that choice away from me when I was too young and too scared to fight her on it. I understand what it does to a person, carrying something like that in silence for years. It doesn't just disappear because you decide to be a good person. It has to go somewhere. Sarah turned her head slightly to look at Diane then, her eyes wet again, though this time there was less shame in them, and more something Diane could not quite name yet. Are you saying you forgive me? Sarah asked, very quietly, as if she did not fully trust the words enough to say them at full volume. I'm saying I understand you, Diane said. Forgiveness is a different thing, and I don't know yet if I'm there. I need you to understand that too. What you were planning, if you had gone through with it, could have destroyed this family. Robert is hurt. The boys don't even know yet, not the full story, and I don't know how to explain any of this to them in a way that makes sense. But I also watched you, for 9 months, become someone who cried on my birthday and learned my mother's pot roast recipe and let my son call you sis without correcting him. I don't think all of that was fake. I don't think a person can fake 9 months of that many small specific things. So I believe you when you say something changed. I just need time to figure out what that means for what happens next. Sarah reached out with her uninjured hand and hesitantly took Diane's, and Diane let her. I don't expect you to just forgive this, Sarah said. I don't even know if I've forgiven myself for it yet. But I want you to know, whatever you decide, whatever happens after tonight, I'm not going to disappear the way I planned to. I'm not going to run. If you want me gone, I'll go quietly. And I won't take anything with me except the truth of what I did wrong. But I'm not going to vanish and let you spend the rest of your life wondering if any part of this was real. That much I owe you, at least. Diane held her hand a little tighter at that, and something in her chest, some final piece of the wall she had built at 19 and reinforced for 25 years, finally, quietly, came down. The weeks that followed were not simple, and Diane never let herself pretend they were. Robert needed more time than Diane did, understandably. He had been hurt in a way that was less complicated than Diane's hurt, less tangled up with decades of guilt and longing, and so his anger, while it eventually softened, took a slower, more careful path back towards something resembling trust. He agreed, eventually, to sit down with Sarah at Diane's request, in the same kitchen where the entire truth had first come spilling out. I need to hear you say it to my face, he told her, his arms crossed, his voice steady but hard. Not to Diane. To me. What you were planning to do to my family. And Sarah, to her credit, did not soften the story for him the way she might have been tempted to. She told him everything, the notebook, the private investigator's file, the careful cataloging of passwords and life insurance policies, and the location of the spare key. And she watched his face harden with every detail, and she did not once ask him to go easy on her. I don't expect you to trust me again quickly, she told him when she finished. I don't think I've earned that yet. But I wanted you to hear it from me, completely, without anything softened, because you deserve that much honesty, even this late. Robert was quiet for a long time after that, turning something over in his mind that Diane could not fully read from his expression. You know what the strange part is, he finally said. I keep thinking about the steaks, teaching you to grill. I've never taught either of my own sons that recipe, not properly, not the way I taught you, because they never asked the way you asked. They never wanted to learn it the way you seem to want to learn it. I keep asking myself if that was part of some plan too, some strategy to get closer to me specifically. And then I remember the look on your face when the steak finally came out right, and I don't think that look can be faked. I've coached Little League for 8 years. I know what a faked win looks like on a kid's face, and that wasn't it. I don't know if I trust you yet, he continued. But I think, given time, I might be able to. Ethan and Marcus were told a version of the truth eventually, one that Diane and Robert crafted carefully together over several long evenings. Honest about the essential facts but gentle in the framing, because they were, after all, still Sarah's brothers, whatever complicated shape that relationship had taken. Marcus, true to his nature, was the more forgiving of the two, shrugging in the particular way 23-year-olds shrug at things that seem to them like ancient history that does not need to be relitigated. People do messed up things when they're hurting, he said. Doesn't mean they stay that person forever. She's still my sister, as far as I'm concerned, unless she does it again. Ethan needed more time, more careful conversations, a slower unfolding of trust that mirrored Robert's own path, but he came around too, eventually, in his own way, showing up one Sunday afternoon with 2 coffees, one for himself, and one, black, no sugar, no cream, silently held out toward Sarah, as a kind of peace offering neither of them needed to explain out loud. Summer arrived, and with it came a new rhythm, slower and more careful than the one that had come before, but steadier for having survived the break in the middle of it. Sarah came around less often at first, giving the family the space to decide, week by week, how much of her they were ready to let back in. But slowly, gradually, the visits increased again, and this time there was a different quality to them. Less performance in the warmth, more honesty in the silences. In July, on a warm evening with the windows open and the smell of Robert's grill drifting through the kitchen, Diane found herself standing beside Sarah at the counter, both of them chopping vegetables for a salad in comfortable, easy silence, and she realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that she was happy. Not the desperate, grasping happiness of those first 9 months, when she had been so hungry for a daughter that she had let herself overlook every warning sign along the way. Something quieter, something that had actually been tested and had actually survived the testing and felt more real for having done so. "I found the notebook the other day," Sarah said suddenly, not looking up from the cutting board. "The old one. I've been meaning to show it to you actually, if you want to see it. I think you should see it. All of it. The planning. And then the part where I stopped planning and started just writing about my day. About the two of you. About the boys. I think you should see exactly where it changed, because I think it might help you believe me more than anything I could say out loud." Diane thought about this for a long moment, the knife still in her hand, a half-chopped tomato in front of her. "Not tonight," she finally said. "But yes, someday. I think I'd like to see that." They finished the salad in silence after that, and later, at dinner, Robert told a story about a client at work that made Marcus laugh so hard he nearly choked on his food. And Sarah laughed too, easily, without calculation. And Diane watched her family, all 4 of them now, sitting around a table that had once held a folder full of financial notes and a plan designed to destroy them, and felt something settle deep inside her chest that had been unsettled for 25 years. It was not a perfect ending. Diane understood that clearly, even in the warmth of that July evening. There would be hard conversations still to come, moments when old trust issues would resurface unexpectedly, times when Robert's guard would go back up over some small thing that reminded him too sharply of the folder, of the passwords, of how close they had come to losing everything to a plan built out of grief disguised as rage. Sarah would carry, for the rest of her life probably, the shame of what she had almost done, and some corner of that shame would likely never fully heal, the way old wounds sometimes leave a permanent ache in certain weather. But it was, Diane thought, watching her daughter laugh at the dinner table beside the son who had learned to call her sister without hesitation, a real ending anyway. A messy, complicated, hard-won kind of real that felt more solid, in its own way, than the effortless fairy tale she had let herself imagine during those first 9 months of blind, grateful joy. Late that night, after the dishes were cleared and the boys had gone home and Robert had fallen asleep in front of the television the way he always did, Diane found Sarah sitting alone on the back porch steps, looking up at a sky just beginning to show its first scattered stars. "Can I ask you something?" Diane said, sitting down beside her. "Anything," Sarah said. "If I hadn't found that folder," Diane asked, "if Patricia had never dug into your past, and none of this ever came out, do you think you would have gone through with it eventually? The plan?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, long enough that Diane thought she might not answer at all. "I think about that question every day," Sarah finally said. "And I want to tell you no, that I would have stopped myself eventually, that the love was already stronger than the plan by then. But honestly, I don't know. I think there was a version of me that might have kept telling herself just a little longer, just one more month of information gathering, right up until the moment it was too late to turn back. I think finding out that you knew, that I'd been caught, might have actually been the thing that saved both of us from finding out the answer to that question the hard way." Diane absorbed this honestly, appreciating it more than a softer, more comfortable lie would have landed. "I'm glad it happened the way it happened," Diane said finally. "Even the hard part. Even the folder, and the fight in the kitchen, and the hospital. Because I don't think we would have gotten here, to this exact porch, on this exact night, any other way. Sometimes I think the only way to actually trust something is to watch it survive being broken first." Sarah leaned her head against Diane's shoulder then, the way daughters do with mothers when words have finally run their course, and only the closeness itself remains to be said. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me, even when you had every reason to." "You're my daughter," Diane said simply, the words landing with a weight and a certainty that felt, for the first time in 25 years, entirely uncomplicated. "I was never going to give up on you. I just needed to finally believe that you weren't going to give up on us either." They sat together on the porch steps a long while after that, beneath a summer sky slowly filling with stars. Two women who had once been strangers, bound only by blood and a 25-year-old wound, now bound by something harder won and infinitely more durable. A family rebuilt not despite its cracks, but because of the honest, painful, necessary work of surviving them together.